On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese planes would attack Pearl Harbor, the American naval base at Hawaii. 2,403 American lives would perish in the attack, with 19 ships and 188 aircraft being destroyed or damaged in the process. Although the attack was a complete surprise for the American public, the assault on Pearl Harbor was far from being a random attack on an unsuspecting enemy. The operation had been meticulously planned for months, with the causes behind it stemming back years. After the Great War, Japan had emerged as a victor state, but had agreed to respect Chinese territorial sovereignty, as well as agreeing to limit their naval capacity to 3/5 the size of British and American fleets. Japanese naval officers, however, resented the restrictions imposed on their fleet at the Washington Naval Conference in 1921. In the West, prejudice against Asian countries was commonplace, with them being seen as places to be colonised by European powers and siphoned of their natural resources. So although Japan, a small island nation, was sitting amongst the greatest industrial powers of the age, Japanese resentment began to build to what they saw as Western arrogance. Not only was Japan's sentiment towards international relations deteriorating, but Japan had also experienced a population boom, with overcrowding and poverty emerging in the growth. Coupled with the Great Depression, many nationalist sentiments began to rise, with military leaders beginning to believe that Japan's future could only be secured through outward expansion, a military conquest to secure new land, oil, raw materials and grain. If Japan could successfully seize new territories, they would be in a position to become a great world power. And so in 1931, Japan staged a railway incident in a northern part of China named Manchuria, claiming the Chinese had destroyed Japanese railway tracks. In response, Japan took over the entire province. The new land would be called Manchukuo, a puppet state controlled by Imperial Japan. Japan's actions brought about international condemnation, with the League of Nations calling for Japanese withdrawal from Manchuria. In response, Japan left the League of Nations, which had once again proven ineffective. Japan would go on, further expanding into China, and by the end of 1937 had seized Shanghai and the city of Nanking. In what later became known as the Rape of Nanking, the Japanese participated in the destruction, widespread slaughter, rape and murder of innocent civilians. 200,000 innocent lives would be taken in less than 6 weeks. International outrage and condemnation of Japanese actions would become the norm, with the United States government giving the Chinese a loan of $25 million to aid in resisting the Japanese invasion. By July 1940, a new leadership had emerged in Japan, with the Ministry of War being spearheaded by a man named Hideki Tojo. Tojo put military expansion as Japan's main goal, pursuing the conquest of Asia and the Pacific. With the Western Allies weakened by German Blitzkrieg, Japan looked to the south, to French Indochina, to the Dutch East Indies and to British Malaya, all of which were ripe for the taking. This move to the south would provide Japan with raw materials, oil and rubber, but risked provoking a war with the West, especially the United States, who had bases in the Philippines. US President Franklin Roosevelt was unsettled by rising fascist powers around the globe and had a desire to step in. But the American people were deeply isolationist. After fighting in the Great War, the American people were reluctant to enter another, with most being unaffected by conflicts happening across the sea. Even with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill petitioning America for help, few were willing to get involved. Yet Roosevelt saw things differently. He believed that letting Britain and France fall to a German invasion, which would wipe out Western democracy in Europe, would come to have disastrous consequences for the United States. And so while he refused to intervene with force, Roosevelt did everything he could to help the Allies with aid, sending American ships into British ports, filled with essential supplies vital for the war effort. In the east, however, a different plan was taken. America's Pacific Fleet was relocated to Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii. With American power now stationed closer to Japan, Roosevelt hoped that it would deter Japanese aggression, with the island nation having to consider its actions more carefully before attacking Allied colonies. But deterrence proved ineffective, with Japan going on to invade French Indochina. Roosevelt responded with economic sanctions, placing an embargo on important naval and aviation supplies to Japan, such as oil, iron ore, steel and rubber. Great Britain and the Netherlands soon followed, with Japan finding itself cut off from 90% of its oil supply. As Japan relied on importing oil, with this resource now cut off, their dreams of empire were now out of reach. Japan was left with three options: back down and forever live in the shadow of Western powers, try and negotiate a deal, or double down and find a new source of oil through conquest. Turning first to negotiation, Japan offered to withdraw from Indochina and parts of the Chinese mainland, but only if the United States would re-establish trade relations as well as support a Japanese acquisition of the Dutch East Indies. The Roosevelt administration rejected the proposals and demanded outright Japanese withdrawal from China. Japan was furious, and the very same day their proposal was rejected, they set sail to an American naval base in Hawaii, a place that went by the name of Pearl Harbor. Mussolini came to power in 1922 and wanted to restore Italy's greatness. His plan was to create a new Roman Empire, but he did not yet have the economic or military capability to do so. In 1935, Mussolini had aligned with Britain and France, opposing plans for German rearmament, but that same year, Italy also invaded Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Abyssinia was a member of the League of Nations and appealed for international help. The British and French in response placed economic sanctions on Italy, although they were more symbolic than effective. Even so, Mussolini now regarded Britain and France as enemies. 5 years later, in 1940, as France was falling to German Blitzkrieg, Mussolini saw his chance and decided to join the side of Hitler and the Nazis. With his new ally, Mussolini's dreams of empire had come closer, and he was now in prime position to seize the British and French territories of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Mussolini's eyes now laid upon Egypt, but there was a problem. Churchill was an enthusiastic imperialist and believed that control of the Mediterranean was vital to Britain's interests. Britain controlled both the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar, the waterways connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. The British colony of Egypt was also pivotal to the British Empire. On the coastline of Egypt lay the Suez Canal, which linked Britain to India, Australia and the Far East, as well as the oil fields of Iraq, Syria and Iran. The canal also facilitated Britain with supplies from the Empire that were vital to the war effort, including oil and food, of which over half were imported. The loss of the Suez Canal would add several weeks to voyages to the east and expose redirected British ships to German U-boats in the Atlantic. The safety and welfare of Britain and its empire would therefore reside directly with Egypt. The fate of Britain lay in the sand. But Mussolini planned to capture Egypt, from which he could threaten British naval bases in the Mediterranean as well as the Suez Canal. And from Mussolini's perspective, he had good reason to think he would be successful. In June 1939, the British Mediterranean fleet had only 45 combat ships against Italy's 183. The Italians also had more submarines, with 108 against Britain's 12. And with France surrendering in June 1940, the entire weight of controlling the Mediterranean Sea would reside with the Royal Navy. On land, the odds were also in Italy's favour. Italy had some 250,000 troops in Libya, with the British only having 100,000 troops, stretched out to defend Egypt, Sudan and Palestine. On the 11th of June 1940, Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, and on September 13th, the Italian 10th Army invaded Egypt from their colony Libya. The Italians invaded quickly and soon captured the coastal town of Sidi Barrani. Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, began to plan a counterattack, which was codenamed Operation Compass. Wavell would send the Western Desert Force, comprised of 36,000 men from Britain, India, Australia and New Zealand. But rather than attacking where the Italians suspected, in December 1940, the Western Desert Force swung south, travelling across the open desert to attack the Italian forces from behind. Wavell's plan had worked, with Italian defences being overrun in a matter of days. In the Battle of Sidi Barrani, the British had managed to capture 40,000 Italian soldiers, with the remainder fleeing west. Italy's hopes of empire were looking unlikely. But for the Italians, it only got worse. Losses would continue, with the British chasing the fleeing troops 500 miles across Libya, with the British going on to capture Bardia, Tobruk, Derna and Benghazi. Wavell's offensive would finally end at El Agheila on the 7th of February 1941. The Italians had nowhere else to run. In just 2 months, the British had destroyed 10 Italian divisions and captured more than 130,000 prisoners. Churchill, confident that North Africa was now under British control, would send a large part of the region's forces to fight in Greece. In April 1939, Mussolini took the first steps towards creating his new empire, occupying Albania to the east. Over a year later, in October 1940, Mussolini marched south into Greece after they refused to become an Italian colony. However, despite Italy's superior numbers, almost double that of the Greeks, they failed to take the country, being pushed out of Greece and much of Albania too. Seeing this as an opportunity to cripple Axis control in the area, Churchill was quick to send aid, diverting British soldiers from North Africa to help the Greeks defend their country and push back Italy. Unfortunately for the Allies, this drew the attention of Hitler, who would not allow his southern flank to become exposed. In April 1941, Hitler sent 500,000 German soldiers southward, quickly overcoming the combined British and Greek forces. Within a month, Athens had fallen, forcing a mass retreat of over 30,000 Allied soldiers to the Greek island of Crete. Germany then attacked Crete, where the British and Greek troops had taken up positions. Hitler had ordered an assault on the island, deploying over 20,000 soldiers who would land via parachute. The invasion was effective, and the island was taken within 2 weeks. While 15,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated, some 18,000 were taken prisoner, with the Royal Navy taking additional losses during the evacuation. Although the mission was a success for Hitler, he had sustained such heavy losses during the invasion, with men being shot down in the sky, that Germany's parachute regiment would not be used again in a major battle for the remainder of the war. While this was a major victory for the Axis powers, it was the first of several times that Mussolini's failures would require Hitler to divert his soldiers to the Mediterranean. This would in time prove to be disastrous for the Führer, as his forces became stretched thin. Having chosen the path of conquest, Japan now looked to the Dutch East Indies and other countries in the Pacific Theatre, countries that would provide them with oil and rubber. But for this plan to work, the Japanese believed that American influence in the region would have to be removed. In other words, Japan's leaders decided that military expansion in Southeast Asia would require an attack on the United States. As the US had recently put their entire Pacific Fleet within striking distance of Japanese forces, Pearl Harbor would become Japan's main target. The attack on Pearl Harbor was masterminded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A gifted naval officer, Yamamoto was reluctant to go to war with the United States, but when war became an inevitability, he knew that the only way for Japan to win was to knock out America's Pacific Fleet before the fighting began. If they couldn't do so, Yamamoto thought that Japan would eventually lose in a prolonged conflict with the United States. Yamamoto believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would give Japan time, around 6 months, to seize the Dutch East Indies and secure control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific without American interference. During this time, Japan could also begin construction of new battleships and aircraft carriers, increasing its presence and naval might in the region. And lastly, Yamamoto's plan assumed that the United States would negotiate peace terms following the loss of its fleet, seeking compromise and accepting Japanese dominance in East Asia. Yamamoto also believed that it was vital to destroy America's aircraft carriers in the attack, as he saw them as being the true heart of a modern navy, as opposed to battleships. But unknown to Yamamoto, US codebreakers had managed to crack the Japanese diplomatic code and knew an attack was imminent, but they didn't know where. With American territory under threat, most at the time thought the Philippines was the most likely target. So when the US command at Pearl Harbor was warned that Japan was on the offensive, all they could do was prepare to mobilize against a threat they thought would strike somewhere in the Pacific, never imagining that they would be the actual target. As a result, Walter Short, the army commander in Hawaii, believed that the most serious threat Pearl Harbor faced was sabotage from the 160,000 Hawaiian residents of Japanese ancestry. The island's planes were then clustered together on the runways so that they could be closely guarded, and military supplies such as anti-aircraft rounds were locked away to prevent sabotage. To reinforce the security of American outposts, 2 of the 3 aircraft carriers were sent from Pearl Harbor to Wake and Midway Island, with the 3rd aircraft carrier undergoing maintenance back on the west coast of the United States. The Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The attackers achieved complete surprise, with almost every American who looked up to the sky and saw the Japanese planes, assuming they were friendly aircraft engaged in training exercises. But then the first bombs exploded. Torpedoes specially designed for shallow waters struck into the side of battleships, while armour-piercing bombs rained down from above, cutting through their decks. Within minutes, the battleships Maryland and Tennessee were each hit, followed by the Arizona, which sank almost instantly. The first Japanese wave consisted of 183 planes, with torpedo bombers attacking the ships and dive bombers simultaneously attacking the airfields, preventing airborne resistance. But unfortunately for the Americans, their anti-sabotage operation had left their planes clustered together, making them ideal targets for Japanese bombs. To make matters worse, they couldn't even shoot back, as their anti-aircraft ammunition had been locked away. 90 minutes later, the attack was over. The Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships and destroyed 188 planes, while damaging 159 others. The attack had killed over 2,000 US servicemen, with nearly half of them on the US battleship Arizona. It appeared to be a total victory for Japan, who had lost only 29 aircraft during the assault. Believing sufficient damage had been done, Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the operation, called off a 3rd attack. However, although Japanese losses were minuscule, victory was not complete. 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor, and 7 heavy cruisers were still out at sea, The attack had also failed to hit American fuel depots and had not destroyed the US submarine base. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the Japanese Empire, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Pearl Harbor would rally the American people, who were once isolationist, into fierce defenders of liberty, with Americans from all over the United States flocking to recruitment stations. Far from wiping out American influence in the Pacific, the Japanese had just awoken a sleeping giant. What had started as a mainly European war had now escalated into a global conflict. In the wake of victory at Pearl Harbor, and thinking that the American fleet had been neutralized, Japan embarked on a devastating path of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within a month, Japan had attacked Thailand, British Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma and Borneo, as well as the American Philippines, Guam and Wake Island. A month later, Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and a month after that, they invaded Singapore, the crown jewel of British imperial rule in the East. The British had fortified Singapore with coastal defence guns, pointing out towards the sea, but Japan were invading from the north, by land and by air. With 30,000 Japanese soldiers attacking on foot through Malaya, the British seemed to be in good position as they sported 85,000 soldiers in the region, comprising of both British, Australian and Indian troops. But the British were outmatched in air power by a factor of 2 to 1, with the Japanese also having both newer and more advanced tanks and aircraft. With Britain and the rest of Europe focusing on Germany in the west, little to no modern weaponry was prioritised for the east. And so with only 30,000 troops, less than a third of British forces, the Japanese quickly broke through the British defensive lines in the north, forcing a retreat back to Singapore itself. In response, Britain sent 2 battleships in support, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, but they were sent without the aid of an aircraft carrier, making the ships vulnerable from the sky. As a result, they were quickly destroyed by Japanese dive bombers, giving Japan naval superiority in Southeast Asia. As Churchill noted at the time, over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. Japan then pushed into Singapore, and after a devastating series of bombing raids by Japanese aircraft, the British garrison was left completely overwhelmed. After a week of fighting, military supplies and rations were running low, with petrol for military vehicles and ammunition for the field artillery and anti-aircraft guns almost completely gone. As a result, the commanding officer, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, initiated the largest surrender in British military history, with 80,000 troops laying down their arms. Allied soldiers were then taken to Japanese prisoner of war camps, being used as slave labour. More than half of those taken would never return home. Burma and the Dutch East Indies fell the next month, and with Britain having been pushed out of Southeast Asia, its position in India was now threatened. 200 years of British supremacy in the East had been brought to an end in a matter of months. In a mere 6 months, Japan had wiped out most of the Allied presence in the Far East, with their conquest of the Pacific almost complete. But as Japan had attacked the US territories of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, as well as Guam and Wake Island, the United States were looking for revenge, and so Roosevelt looked for a way to strike back against the Japanese in an attempt to boost morale and give the American public something to celebrate. Famous military pilot Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was then tasked with finding volunteers for an important mission. He would gather the best pilots available at the 17th Bombardment Group in Florida. Their plan was to use land-based army bombers, which could launch off an aircraft carrier 600 miles from Japan's coast, and then proceed to drop their bombs on Japanese cities, including Tokyo, before heading west and landing in China. The plan was accepted. The USS Hornet was then loaded by crane with 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, each comprising of 5 crewmen. As the bombers were designed for land, each had to be specially adjusted so they could carry double their usual fuel supply. 4 days after passing Hawaii, the bombers would be forced to take off early after being spotted by Japanese reconnaissance ships. With strong winds helping the bombers lift off the flight deck, Doolittle would go up first, not waiting for the rest of the group to join him as it would waste precious fuel. As the last plane went airborne, the carriers turned 180 degrees, racing away from Japan. All 16 American bombers would successfully find their targets, striking Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe and Tokyo. After unloading their bombs, all pilots turned west to China, apart from one, who headed towards the Soviet Union due to low fuel. When they arrived in China, it was nightfall, and unable to see the landing grounds, the pilots and crew had to parachute out of the planes, often landing in remote Chinese villages. Against all odds, 73 of the 80 Doolittle raiders would make it back to the United States. Although the attack was militarily insignificant, only killing around 50 people, it came as a deep psychological shock to the Japanese people. Up to this point, they had only seen success after success, with it being almost unthinkable that Japan itself might be attacked. Back in the United States, Doolittle would go on to receive the Medal of Honor, with the raid itself becoming known as the Doolittle Raid. But for the Japanese, American aircraft carriers became a priority. They would have to be destroyed if Japan was to remain safe. Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Japan in 1942 had highlighted the vulnerability of the island nation and prompted Japan to solidify their position in East Asia and the Pacific. But in order to do this, the Japanese would have to capture the rest of New Guinea. With New Guinea under Japanese control, it would allow them to establish a vertical defensive line along the Pacific, behind which they could establish their maritime empire, a region they referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. From New Guinea, Japan could launch attacks and drive the US out of Midway and Hawaii, giving them complete supremacy over the region, but it would also allow Japan to isolate Australia, as well as further expand into New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa. For the Japanese, New Guinea was a strategic necessity. But in order to capture the rest of New Guinea, Japan would have to take over the southern half of the island, in particular the harbour and Port Moresby. As the Japanese prepared to take the port, US intelligence at Station Hypo managed to decipher the Japanese military code, with Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, sending the aircraft carriers USS Lexington and Yorktown to intercept the Japanese strike group on their way. And so began the Battle of the Coral Sea. The US aircraft carriers under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and the Japanese carriers under the command of Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara both sent out search planes to look for their enemy. The American force soon came into contact with the Japanese carrier Shoho, and after a brief attack of dive bombers and torpedo bombers, the Shoho would sink just 7 minutes after taking the first hit. It was Imperial Japan's first major combatant loss in the war. The Battle of the Coral Sea would be the first all-aircraft naval battle in history, with the Japanese and American fleets never coming into view of one another. After 2 days of heavy fighting, it would appear to be a draw. The United States had lost the large carrier Lexington, and the Japanese the small carrier Shoho. The US had lost 81 planes to Japan's 105, with most American pilots being recovered from the sea. But strategically, it was a tactical victory for the United States, as they had successfully stopped the invasion of Port Moresby. Crucially, it was the first time in the Pacific War that Japan had failed to take over a region they had targeted. Six months after Pearl Harbor, and 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japan were ready to strike again. Yamamoto believed it was crucial for the American aircraft carriers to be destroyed, as they posed an enormous risk to mainland Japan, as shown with the Doolittle raids. But in order for them to be destroyed, they would have to be brought out into the open. And so Yamamoto set up an elaborate plan. Japan would invade the US island of Midway, which served as an airbase and refueling station for US aircraft. The small island of Midway was not of any particular strategic importance for Japan, but the Japanese knew the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost that provided them a defensive line for Pearl Harbor, and therefore they would have no choice but to defend the island. With the American fleet being sent in defense, its aircraft carriers would be open to attack, where Japanese submarines, battleships, and a fleet of aircraft carriers known as the Kido Butai would be waiting to ambush them. It seemed to be a brilliant plan, but unknown to the Japanese, there were two major flaws. First, the Japanese thought the Americans only had 2 aircraft carriers, believing they had already sunk both the Lexington and Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but the Yorktown still survived. And second, the Americans knew the entire plan. On May 7th, 1942, the same day that American pilots sank the carrier Shoho in the Coral Sea, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had intercepted and deciphered several messages that the Japanese were planning a major attack on a target codenamed AF. Joseph Rochefort, head of the code-breaking operation at Station Hypo, believed that AF was the Japanese code for Midway, but in order to make sure and provide proof to his superiors, he devised a cunning plan. The base at Midway would send out an uncoded radio message to Hawaii, falsely stating that their water purification system had broken down. Sure enough, within 24 hours, American codebreakers picked up a Japanese message that stated AF was short on water. Rochefort's suspicions had been confirmed. They were able to further determine the date of the attack as either the 4th or 5th of June, as well as the Japanese strategy. All this information was then sent to the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Chester Nimitz, who decided to set a trap of his own. Nimitz's plan would utilize the element of surprise. He would send all 3 of his aircraft carriers several hundred miles north of Midway, to a position named Point Luck, correctly calculating that the Japanese would never look there. From this position, once the Japanese had launched an attack on Midway, their carriers would be exposed, making them easy targets for American pilots. Nimitz's plan was in place. He would then refuel the Hornet and Enterprise and repair the damaged Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance would command the Hornet and Enterprise, while Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would command the Yorktown. Spruance would head out first, and 2 days later, on the 30th of May, the Yorktown would set sail, with workmen remaining on board making last-minute repairs. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would launch a total of 108 aircraft, all sent to attack the island of Midway. A wave of Japanese bombers appeared over the island, striking at the airfields below. But unexpectedly, the US bombers, one of their main targets, were nowhere to be seen, and the airfields lay practically empty. Instead, the Japanese would face a squadron of outdated American Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcat fighters. While most were shot down by the far superior Japanese Zeros, they had managed to slightly blunt the Japanese attack. The initial attack had not succeeded, and American bombers could still use the airbase to refuel and attack the Japanese invasion force. The commander of the strike force, Lieutenant Joichi Tomanaga, radioed back that a second strike was needed in order to fully destroy the American base, but as the Japanese prepared for a second strike, the bombers from Midway appeared overhead. The American force consisted of an assortment of Army, Marine and Navy planes, but they were all outdated and the Japanese Zeros quickly shot them down. Admiral Nagumo was then told one of his search planes had sighted what appeared to be a carrier. As American carriers were the actual target of the whole operation, Nagumo decided not to attack Midway again, and instead head north in pursuit. 2 more waves of American aircraft would attack the Japanese fleet, but the planes were uncoordinated and shot down. Of the 41 torpedo bombers the Americans sent to attack the Japanese fleet that morning, only 4 of them safely returned, with none able to place a single torpedo on target. The Americans, even with the element of surprise, appeared to have failed. The Japanese were winning the Battle of Midway. It was an almost unprecedented disaster for America. It would be the next 10 minutes that changed the course of the battle, and subsequently, the entire Pacific War. A squadron from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, then arrived at the Japanese fleet's original coordinates, not knowing they had moved north. McCluskey and his men had a difficult decision to make: head back to the Enterprise or go searching for the Japanese fleet and possibly run out of fuel. Luckily, McCluskey then spotted a single Japanese destroyer named the Arashi moving northward, as it had been left behind to fight off the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey assumed that the destroyer was heading north to rejoin its fleet, and he was right. His air group flew northward, and soon found themselves above the entire Japanese carrier fleet. Although the previous attacks on the Japanese fleet had been unsuccessful, many of the Zero fighter planes were now running low on fuel and ammunition. As McCluskey's bombers began to attack, another squadron of dive bombers arrived from the Yorktown. The largest carrier, the Kaga, would be hit first, with a dozen 500 and 1,000-pound bombs setting it ablaze within minutes. The Akagi would be next, with a fatal 1,000-pound bomb penetrating the centre of the flight deck, exploding the 18 fully loaded torpedo bombers on board. Simultaneously, bombers from the Yorktown attacked the Soryu, which was set alight within seconds. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had now been obliterated, with only the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, managing to escape. The Hiryu, in desperation for revenge, then launched an attack against the Yorktown, which would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine. In retaliation, all available aircraft from the Enterprise and Hornet were sent to sink the Hiryu, and they were successful. The Kido Butai was now gone. In just a single day, Japan's naval power had been completely obliterated. Yamamoto's plan had backfired, and the United States were now free to roam the Pacific. But the Battle of Midway redefined the importance of air superiority for the remainder of the war, and with 4 Japanese carriers out of the equation, the Japanese would never again launch a major offensive in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor and Midway were now secured for the United States, but just 1 month later, both sides would be engulfed in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Churchill saw Greece as an important anti-German position, and therefore thought it wise to send British troops there from North Africa. However, Churchill was unaware that at the same time he was sending troops to fight in Greece, Hitler was preparing to send German forces to Africa. Hitler saw Mussolini's failures in North Africa as endangering the Axis war effort, leaving Germany vulnerable to the south, and so to support Italian resistance, in February 1941, Hitler sent in the Afrika Korps, 65,000 men under the command of Major General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a distinguished soldier in the Great War and had commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the 1940 invasion of France. He proved himself an effective tank commander, and it would not be long until he was given the nickname the Desert Fox. Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941, quickly using his forces to push back the British stationed at El Agheila, whose numbers had been reduced by the war in Greece. The British would go on to see defeat after defeat, being pushed out of Benghazi in April and retreating all the way back to Tobruk. Rommel continued to drive east, surrounding the 9th Australian Division at Tobruk on April 10th. However, he was unable to take the port, and so left behind a small force of Italian soldiers as he continued to push the British towards the Egyptian border. It was a decision Rommel later regretted, as the Australian garrison at Tobruk held out against the siege for 240 days, tying down important Axis manpower and supplies. On April 14th, Rommel's main force reached the Egyptian border, with his troops occupying the key territory of the Halfa Pass. Unable to advance any further because of supply shortages, Rommel's forces began to dig in and fortified their position with 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The area was so well fortified that the British would soon refer to Halfa Pass as Hellfire Pass. Under continuing pressure from Churchill, Wavell was tasked to launch an offensive in order to regain Tobruk. Churchill also sent reinforcements, including more men and new tanks, and so on the 15th of June, Wavell launched his attack, but German defences proved too strong, with their anti-aircraft and anti-tank weaponry blunting the advance. In just 4 days, Britain had lost 98 state-of-the-art tanks. Wavell's attempts to regain Tobruk had failed, and so Churchill sent him to India, and replaced him with a new Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, Claude Auchinleck. Once he arrived in North Africa, Auchinleck took some time to reorganise and train his forces, the British 8th Army. The 8th Army were in a good position, having double the aircraft and triple the tanks to their German and Italian counterparts. And so in November 1941, Auchinleck launched Operation Crusader, a major offensive to help the besieged garrison at Tobruk. The operation was a success. After several days of battle, the Germans had run out of fuel supplies, and Tobruk was regained on the 7th of December. With Rommel withdrawing his forces and the British close on his tail, he would be forced to fall all the way back to where he started, at El Agheila. But victory would not last long for the British. A few months later, on the 21st of January 1942, Rommel would launch another offensive, with new tanks and more supplies. The British were unprepared, with the Germans taking Benghazi and forcing them to withdraw to a defensive position named the Gustav Line. It was now May, and not wanting to fight the British in a heavily fortified position head-on, under the cover of night, Rommel's forces would drive south, coming up behind the British forces in the morning. For the next few days, both sides would take heavy losses, but Rommel was able to capture a few British units. Auchinleck, threatened with his forces being completely cut off, began a retreat eastwards towards Egypt. Rommel now had a clear path to Tobruk, and on the 20th of June he attacked. What had previously taken nearly a year to capture was now taken in a single day. Tobruk and its 32,000 troops had surrendered, and Rommel took over its significant amount of supplies, including 2.5 million gallons of fuel, as well as 2,000 vehicles. It was the greatest British surrender since the fall of Singapore, and Churchill was furious. But the situation only got worse. Rommel continued to push forward, attacking the heavily fortified town of Mersa Matruh. The Indian infantry brigade stationed there was nearly wiped out, with 6,000 men being killed and 40 tanks destroyed. Auchinleck had to fall back yet again, this time to the coastal town of El Alamein, 120 miles to the east. Rommel would continue his pursuit, but Auchinleck and the 8th Army had prepared a heavily fortified defensive position at El Alamein. The town was protected on its southern flank by the Qattara Depression, a stretch of sunken ground that was impossible to manoeuvre through, and so if Rommel was to attack, it would have to be head-on. And so on the 1st of July, Rommel attacked. The First Battle of El Alamein had begun, but British defences proved to be too strong. The fighting would last almost a month, with both sides suffering similar losses. With Rommel unable to break through, Auchinleck ordered a counterattack, but it was unsuccessful. Now low on fuel, Rommel withdrew his men and began to prepare for a second attack. A few weeks later, and frustrated with British losses, Churchill visited Cairo in an attempt to boost morale and rally the troops. Although Auchinleck had successfully halted the German advance at El Alamein, Churchill believed him to be too passive and replaced him with Lieutenant General Harold Alexander, with Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery being placed in command of the 8th Army. Churchill gave them just one order: destroy Rommel's forces once and for all. Montgomery then received information from British codebreakers that Rommel was planning another attack on El Alamein. Suspecting this time Rommel would try and flank his position, Montgomery began to fortify the ridge of Alem Halfa to the southeast. This information proved true, and on the 30th of August, Rommel launched his offensive. But the attack took him much longer than expected, with Rommel's forces having to plough through minefields and deal with tanks getting bogged down in quicksand. Rommel's assault would last for 3 days, but he was unable to break through. The British were supported by the Royal Air Force, who made easy work of the German panzers. With his tanks being destroyed by British fighter pilots, as well as a lack of fuel and undesirable strategic positioning, Rommel's Africa Corps withdrew. With Rommel being forced back, he set up a defensive line just west of El Alamein, between the Qattara Depression and the African coastline. Montgomery was ordered to give chase, but he refused. He wanted to keep his forces intact for the main battle which was about to come. As the Battle of Stalingrad and the Guadalcanal campaign ravaged on, so began the Second Battle of El Alamein. Rommel's position was impossible to outflank, and knew the Allies would have to fight him head-on, and so he fortified his position with 3 million landmines, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression. Rommel's position was so well fortified that it was quickly given the nickname the Devil's Gardens. Panzers were also kept in reserve to quickly deal with any British soldiers who managed to break through, but defence was prioritised for good reason. After the fall of Tobruk, Franklin Roosevelt had immediately offered help, sending the British 300 state-of-the-art Sherman tanks, as well as 100 self-propelled guns. The British now possessed 190,000 men, as well as over 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery guns, and 1,400 anti-tank guns. The Germans were outnumbered in almost every category 2 to 1. To make matters worse for Rommel, British intelligence via Ultra were able to gather knowledge of virtually every Mediterranean convoy that set sail to North Africa, severely reducing Axis shipments by up to 70%. Although the British had complete numerical superiority, Montgomery realised the strength of the Axis defences and ignored the pleas of Churchill for an early attack. He would instead wait for 2 months, building up his forces as well as improving morale and training. When Montgomery was able to attack, he wanted to be ready. The day of attack would come on the 23rd of October 1942. That night, Montgomery unleashed an enormous artillery barrage on the German position, so Operation Lightfoot could begin. During the night, and under the cover of artillery fire, British engineers approached the Devil's Gardens. Along with the help of Scorpion tanks equipped with rotating chains to destroy anti-tank mines, the British manually cleared a path through the minefield, so tanks were able to get through. However, this strategy yielded few results, with the British quickly being pushed back. A week later, and to the north, Montgomery would launch Operation Supercharge, effectively throwing everything the Allies had against Rommel. The strategy worked, with divisions from Britain, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand bravely pushing forward. After 10 days of bloody conflict, the Allies were able to break the German lines. Rommel simply didn't have enough manpower to fight back, and with advancing British forces soon able to cut off Rommel's supply lines, he was forced to withdraw. Montgomery, ever cautious, was slow to pursue, allowing Rommel to escape with most of his forces. And so on the 3rd of November, the 1,400-mile pursuit to Tunisia began. For the next 3 months, Montgomery would chase Rommel across the northern coast of Africa, with Rommel reaching Tripoli on January 23rd and the Tunisian border by the end of the month. By the time Rommel got to Tunisia, however, another enemy would be waiting for him: the Americans. With conflicts being fought over the whole of North Africa, islands and countries surrounding the war zone became of high strategic importance. In 1940, Mussolini had turned his attention to the British-controlled island of Malta, just south of Italy. The island was an important refueling station for submarines and aircraft, and allowed Britain to raid Italian and German convoys travelling to North Africa, with Churchill calling the island an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Malta was also the only Allied base between Gibraltar and Alexandria in Egypt, making it a key strategic power in the region. Upon declaring war in 1940, Mussolini had called for an offensive throughout the Mediterranean, with the first bombs being dropped on Malta within hours. The bombing campaign would last nearly 2 years, and inflicted terrible damage and suffering on the island and its people. The Italian bombing campaign saw initial success, as Britain had failed to station sufficient fighter aircraft on the island. But the British soon responded. On November 11, 1940, Britain launched a raid on the Italian Navy in the harbour of Taranto, sending 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers in a surprise assault. The campaign was a huge success, with the Italian fleet withdrawing to Naples. The British had managed to disable half of the Italian battleships, leaving only 3 in working condition. The Italian Navy had lost 3 battleships, along with 2 destroyers and 1 cruiser. Proof that an air attack on naval vessels could inflict significant damage, and something the Japanese paid close attention to. 4 months later, a similar raid was launched, with another Italian battleship being taken out of action. With only 2 active battleships left, Mussolini was quickly losing control of the Mediterranean Sea. This again drew the attention of Hitler, who diverted more forces south to aid his Italian ally. The Luftwaffe arrived over Malta in early 1941, beginning a bombing raid that would last for months. While the British forces mounted some resistance, they were soon worn down by the constant bombardment. By the summer of 1942, Malta's situation was looking bleak, with the island having exhausted nearly all of its supplies. Britain attempted to send aid from Gibraltar and Egypt, but the convoys were intercepted, with only 2 of the 17 ships surviving the trip. With the people of Malta in dire conditions, and realising the island might soon be lost, which would give control of the Mediterranean over to Germany, Britain launched Operation Pedestal on August 3, 1942. 14 merchant ships would be sent through the Mediterranean via the Straits of Gibraltar, accompanied by a massive naval escort, the largest and most powerful escort ever given to an Allied convoy. The 14 merchant ships would be escorted by 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 light cruisers, 4 corvettes, 4 minesweepers, 11 submarines, and 32 destroyers. The task was daunting, with them having to find their way through heavily patrolled German and Italian waters. On the first day alone, the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle would be sunk by a submarine, with air attacks delivering extensive damage over the coming days. But the British were determined to break through. After 2 weeks of bombardment, just 5 of the merchant ships managed to reach Malta, but it came at a high cost. 9 of the 14 merchant ships would be sunk, along with 1 aircraft carrier, 2 light cruisers and a destroyer, with other ships being severely damaged. But most importantly, the supplies saved the island. 55,000 tons of supplies would be delivered, providing oil, food and Supermarine Spitfires, transforming the island's defences. The British could now continue to disrupt Axis operations in the Mediterranean, with 27 Axis ships being sunk that September and October alone. The island of Malta would be awarded the George Cross by Britain, the highest award for civilian courage, for the Maltese people's remarkable resilience and heroism. After the Battle of Tunisia, the attacks on Malta were rapidly reduced, with the siege ending that November in 1942. The island of Malta would play a key role in the upcoming months, providing the Allies with a base to invade Sicily after the success of Operation Torch. On the 8th of November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing American and British troops in North Africa. They would land in the French colonies of Morocco and Algeria, just south of Spain, with their ultimate destination being Tunis, a coastal city and the capital of Tunisia. With Tunis under Allied control, this would provide a port to protect Allied shipping convoys, as well as an airbase to bomb Sicily and attack Rommel supply lines. However, senior US commanders were initially against landing troops in North Africa, believing the Roosevelt administration should focus on Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. But the British had rejected the plan, believing the Allies were not yet ready. Roosevelt, however, was concerned about a possible Russian collapse, believing a second front must be launched in order to relieve Stalin of pressure, and so he decided to send troops to Africa. This decision, Roosevelt believed, would show the American public that some kind of action was being taken to fight against Hitler, as well as provide valuable training for American soldiers who had not yet experienced war. American General Dwight Eisenhower would command the operation, with British General Harold Alexander doing most of the planning. As they landed in the French territories of Algeria and Morocco, they met little resistance, with the French troops stationed there soon surrendering and joining the Allies in the fight against Germany. With the French now on the Allies' side, Hitler was furious, sending in German troops to southern France that had previously escaped Nazi occupation. Hitler also sent reinforcements to Tunisia, fully taking over the French colony. German troops also tried to seize the French fleet at the port of Toulon on France's southern coast. However, the French soldiers positioned there scuttled 77 ships before the Germans could seize them. Back in Africa, the British kept pushing forward, soon reaching Tunisia, where Rommel had built up a defensive position. But the Americans went in overconfident and attacked Rommel at the Kasserine Pass, the first battle of the war that would take place between the United States and Germany. Completely inexperienced, American troops suffered many casualties and were pushed back nearly 50 miles. 3,300 American soldiers were killed or wounded, with another 3,000 being taken into prisoner of war camps. Churchill's worries about a cross-channel invasion not being feasible with the current training of American troops had proven correct. They needed more time to train. However, after being pushed back, the Americans were joined by the 8th Army, with Rommel now facing growing British and American strength. With the Allies having regrouped, they pushed into Tunisia in April 1943. The fighting would last for almost a month, and with Hitler failing to reinforce Rommel with supplies, the Germans were running low on ammunition, fuel and food. Being pushed all the way back to Tunis, the Germans tried to fight back against the Allies, but it wasn't enough. On the 7th of May, the Allies entered the city, and 5 days later, the German and Italian troops surrendered. The battle for North Africa was over. After months of fighting, the Allies had won. 40,000 Axis soldiers would die in Tunisia alone, with a further 240,000, a quarter of a million men, being taken as prisoners. The loss of these men would prove detrimental to Axis defences, with the invasions of Sicily, Italy and France all on the horizon. Mussolini looked to North Africa in fear. He was now living on borrowed time. With North Africa firmly under Allied control, Sicily would become the new point of focus. The Soviets had been asking the Allies to open a second front, preferably through France, in order to alleviate the Soviet army. The United States agreed with the Soviets, but Britain, who had been fighting for 2.5 years longer than the Americans, refused to go through with the plan. Their army after North Africa was beginning to run short of manpower, and so if an invasion of France was unsuccessful, they wouldn't be able to attack again. The Americans reluctantly agreed to postpone the invasion of France, but wanted to take action soon, fearing that the Soviets could crumble to a Nazi invasion at any second, leaving Hitler and his armies free to attack the West. Sicily would now become the Allies' main focus, providing a launch pad to which they could invade Italy and then push through towards Germany itself. In order to invade Sicily, however, the Allies would first launch Operation Mincemeat, a deception campaign aimed to confuse and divert Axis forces stationed on the island. British intelligence would dress the corpse of a homeless man in a Royal Marine uniform and let his body drift towards the coast of Spain, carrying fake secret documents. The documents stated that the Allies were planning on invading Greece and that a fake diversionary attack aimed at Sicily would occur at the same time. German intelligence believed the documents to be genuine and began to divert soldiers to the Greek mainland. With the Germans and Italians focusing on Greece, the Allies would launch Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, on July 10, 1943. The operation would be commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower and General Harold Alexander. The fighting itself, however, would see another two leaders, with the American Western Task Force being commanded by George Patton, and the British and Canadian Eastern Task Force being commanded by Bernard Montgomery. They would initially lead 160,000 men into battle, with the number soon rising to 500,000. They would be up against 300,000 Axis forces, many of whom had low morale after their defeat in North Africa. After a series of amphibious landings that didn't go to plan, with bad weather steering the Allies off course, they were able to push northward, driving the Axis into retreat. However, Montgomery's slow and methodical advance on the eastern side of the island had allowed the Axis forces to create fortified defences as they withdrew. The hardest to break would be the Etna Line, a defensive stronghold next to the volcano Mount Etna, with the Allies having to push through steep hills, mountainous terrain, and impassable minefields. On the other side of the island, however, the United States were able to quickly advance northward, eventually capturing Palermo, the island's capital, taking 53,000 Italian troops captive in the process. With the city taken, American forces could now help the British and Canadians push through the Etna Line. The Allies soon broke through, with German high command quickly ordering a retreat. On August 11th, a massive fleet of transport ships would arrive at northern Sicily, with more than 100,000 Axis forces escaping into Italy. The invasion of Sicily was a massive success for the Allies. Not only did it provide vital experience for the amphibious landings that were soon to take place in France, but it had also provided relief to the Soviets. A week after the Allies invaded the island, Hitler had diverted troops from the Eastern Front in an attempt to secure Germany's southern flank. In just 38 days of fighting in Sicily, Allied forces had killed or wounded over 29,000 men, almost double their own casualties, along with 140,000 German and Italian soldiers being taken captive. Allied control of the Mediterranean would greatly reduce the amount of shipping that was previously lost to Axis naval forces in the area, with more food, weaponry and medical supplies now reaching the front lines. What Churchill had described as the soft underbelly of Europe, for now seemed to be a reality. With Sicily firmly under British and American control, Churchill suggested the Allies invade Italy, or what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. This plan, Churchill argued, would tie down Axis forces, drawing troops away from the Russian front, therefore responding to Soviet demands for Allied action. but it would also reposition German forces away from France, where the Allies were planning to invade in 1944. Control of Italy would also secure the Mediterranean Sea, as well as provide the Allies with new air bases from which they could intensify bombing on Germany. With Churchill outright refusing to land at Normandy until they had sufficient resources to do so, and Stalin urging for immediate action to be taken, Roosevelt reluctantly agreed that an invasion of Italy was the only reasonable alternative. Just before the Allies invaded Italy, however, Mussolini had been removed from office. On July 24, 1943, 2 weeks after the invasion of Sicily, the Grand Council of Fascism had voted 19-7 to depose Mussolini, with Italy's king then removing him from office. He was replaced by a man called Pietro Badoglio, who assured Germany of his loyalty while he secretly negotiated with the Allies. But he proved to be completely incompetent, with Germany soon seizing key military positions throughout Italy, and Mussolini being placed back in power as head of the German-occupied Italian Socialist Republic in the north. But for the Allies, Italy was now controlled by Nazi Germany, and the commander of the Axis forces in the region, General Albert Kesselring, would prove to be a formidable opponent. Kesselring's plan wasn't to drive the Allies completely out of Italy, but to make their advance northwards as slow, painful and costly as possible. He would later become known as a master of defensive warfare. On September 3rd, 1943, the British 8th Army under the command of General Bernard Montgomery crossed the Strait of Messina from Sicily and invaded the Italian mainland, landing at the coasts of Reggio and Taranto in the extreme south of the country. Montgomery's men would meet little opposition, having no trouble coming ashore and setting up bases. However, the British advance northward would soon be slowed down, with the 8th Army having to navigate through demolished bridges, roadblocks, mines and booby traps. The Germans were determined to make even the moving of supplies as difficult as possible. 6 days after the British landings, the US 5th Army under General Mark Clark launched Operation Avalanche, landing 165,000 Allied troops at Salerno, the western side of Italy. But unlike the British, the Americans encountered heavy German resistance. Believing they had the element of surprise, Clark's forces had not bombarded the shores with artillery, leaving German defences intact. So when the Allies went ashore, German panzers lay waiting for them. The battle turned into a bloodbath, with Clark's forces nearly having to retreat completely, but the Allies were soon able to bring in naval gunfire, driving the Germans back. After a week of fighting, both sides had suffered heavy losses, with the Allies having lost 2,000 men, with a further 7,000 being wounded. Having failed to break through the Allied lines, Kesselring was ordered to retreat, where he would begin to set up additional defensive lines further north. The Germans would take full advantage of the terrain Italy had to offer, with the Allies encountering German defensive positions anchored in rivers, valleys and mountains, each of which had to be captured before the advance could continue. Eventually, Allied progress would come to a halt at the heavily fortified Gustav Line, which stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea in the west, across the Apennines all the way to the Adriatic. It lay 100 miles south of Rome, and it's where the Allies would be stuck for the next 6 months. They would make repeated attempts to break through, but each time would end in failure. And to make matters worse, as the bulk of the Allied forces had reached the line, winter had just begun. They would be met with heavy rain, sleet and snow, as well as chilling winds and blizzards. Soldiers would develop pneumonia, fevers, respiratory diseases, and a fungal infection called trench foot, where wet socks had not been removed for days on end. Thousands would die to the weather alone. Bogged down by mud, mountains, snow and rivers, if the Allies wanted to advance, they would have to break the Gustav Line, and in particular, a hilltop monastery named Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was a 1,400-year-old hilltop monastery founded by St. Benedict that lay at the western end of the Gustav Line. It had become an extremely strong German defensive position, with its location controlling access to both the Liri Valley and Highway 6, the path that led to Rome. With its heavily fortified mountain defences, including concrete bunkers, minefields, tunnels and vast river crossings, Cassino was the most important and the most difficult defensive position the Allies would have to fight for. The Allies would make their first assault on the 17th of January 1944, with 2 more attacks following a few days later, but they were simply unable to break through. German defences were too strong. Allied attacks would soon renew, and by the middle of February, some battles were seeing the Allies have to sustain losses of up to 80%. The current course of action could not continue. The focus of Allied leadership began to turn to the monastery itself, with them believing the Germans were using it as an observation post from where they could make more accurate artillery fire. It was this German exploitation, they believed, that was preventing them from breaching the Gustav Line. But this was not the case. Despite the monastery being a great potential observation post, because of its historical significance, German commander Albert Kesselring had agreed with the Vatican not to use the building in their defensive positioning, and he had kept his word. Despite this, and after much contemplation, on the 15th of February 1944, the Allies took the controversial decision to bomb the monastery, with more than 200 bombers turning it into a pile of rubble. To make matters worse, the air raids were not followed up with an immediate ground attack, leaving the Germans to occupy the ruins, creating an even more impenetrable defence. When the Allies did eventually attack a few days later, it was to no avail. The German line was now stronger than ever. A third major battle would occur in March, with the weather and in particular heavy rain making life difficult for soldiers on both sides. For the Allies, things on the front lines were only getting worse, with the 4th Indian Division and the 2nd New Zealand Division having lost nearly 5,000 men. The Gustav Line seemed to be impenetrable, with the tough and grueling combat pushing many soldiers to their breaking point. If Italy was to be captured, it seemed the Allies would have to look for an opening somewhere else. As the attack on the Gustav Line began in January, Allied High Command had been planning for another amphibious landing, codenamed Operation Shingle, which they hoped would break the deadlock. The plan was to land troops behind the Gustav Line, forcing the Germans to withdraw their men from Monte Cassino, which would open a path for the Allies to advance to Rome. The location chosen was a small coastal city on the western side of Italy named Anzio, which lay 25 miles south of Rome and 70 miles behind enemy lines. The Allies landed at Anzio on the 22nd of January 1944, virtually unopposed, and by the end of the first day alone, more than 36,000 troops had come ashore. The man in command of the operation, Major General John Lucas, was then told a reconnaissance unit had found an open path to Rome, but Lucas was hesitant, claiming his men were not yet ready to advance. Instead, he decided to dig in, to create a base on the beachhead and wait for a German attack. Kesselring was quick to respond, sending his reserve armies from Rome and northern Italy, as well as men from the Gustav Line. Just 3 days after the Allies had landed, 40,000 German troops surrounded the beachhead. Lucas's lack of initiative would anger Churchill, who complained to his chiefs of staff, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." Another week would pass, with the Germans now sporting 71,000 men against the Allies' 60,000. And just like the fighting over at Monte Cassino, the Allies would have to deal with awful terrain. The beachhead comprised of low-lying marshlands with no available cover, and the trenches soon filled up with water, with the soil unable to absorb the rain. This would leave the Allies exposed to German artillery, which included an enormous 280mm railway gun called Anzio Annie that bombarded away at the Allied beachhead. The Luftwaffe also attacked them from the skies, with ships close to the shore, including the Royal Navy, having to reposition to another location to avoid being sunk, removing naval fire support from the area. Under constant bombardment, the Allies would make multiple attempts to break out, but each time they would fail. Allied High Command soon lost confidence in Lucas's leadership, and on the 22nd of February, he was replaced by General Lucian Truscott of the US 3rd Division. Luckily for Truscott, as he took command, German tactics had changed. On the 29th of February, Kesselring ordered an attack on Allied defences, which saw his men flinging themselves in the pouring rain against barbed wire and machine gun pit trenches, but to no avail. Allied artillery would help crush the attacks, with the German army taking heavy losses. After 2 months of intense fighting, the Battle of Anzio had come to yet another deadlock. The Germans had contained the Allied invasion force, but they were unable to push them back into the sea. By the end of March, 90,000 German troops had surrounded the Allies, but no major battles would occur. Instead, the deadlock continued, and much like the First World War, artillery barrages and the patrolling of no man's land became the norm. Artillery would cause the bulk of casualties for both sides, but since the Allies were stationed on mosquito-infested marshes, malaria, trenchfoot, and a host of other diseases would begin to take their toll, with Allied non-combat casualties reaching more than 37,000 by the end of the campaign. Further south, the Allies had been making progress at the Gustav Line. With the arrival of spring weather, the muddy roads had hardened, allowing for the deployment of larger artillery as well as more men. And so on the 11th of May 1944, the Allies launched Operation Diadem, with a massive artillery bombardment smashing into German defences. The Gustav Line was beginning to break. On the 17th, the Polish 2nd Corps began their assault on Monte Cassino, and by the next day had occupied the previous German position. Although the capture of Monte Cassino had been a success, it had come at a high price, with the Allies having suffered 55,000 casualties, the bloodiest battle of the entire Italian campaign. With Monte Cassino now firmly in Allied hands, as well as troops now entering the Liri Valley, German High Command could see their supply lines had been breached, and so ordered a tactical retreat further north to the Hitler Line. On the 23rd of May, the Allied assault on the Hitler Line would begin, with them breaking through after just 2 days of fighting. There was now a clear path to Rome. Back at Anzio, after a 4-month stalemate in which more than 7,000 men had died and more than 36,000 had been injured, Allied forces at the beachhead now reached 150,000. With the fall of Monte Cassino and the collapse of the Gustav Line, on the 23rd of May, the same day the Allies attacked the Hitler Line, General Lucian Truscott decided to launch a breakout offensive. The morning would begin with 1,500 artillery shells bombarding German defences for almost an hour. After this, they would begin their advance, but this time the Allied attacks would prove successful, and after just 2 days of fighting, the German army was in full retreat. Now able to push through from Anzio, the Allies' plan was to drive east and capture the Germans retreating from the Gustav and Hitler Line. But as they were doing so, General Mark Clark ordered Truscott to stop advancing east and instead to push north towards Rome. This sudden change of plans did not go down well with other Allied leadership, but Clark was determined that the US Fifth Army and not the British should be first seen entering Rome. In other words, Clark would let the Germans escape, as long as it meant the United States reached Rome before the British. Although getting to Rome first would be a great political victory, it would turn out to be a military disaster, and a decision the Allies would later regret, as the same men they had let escape were now preparing for battle further north, a battle that would cost the lives of thousands of men. With the Allies advancing quickly northward, on the 3rd of June, Kesselring would declare Rome an open city, with his forces in the area having been pulled back to a defensive stronghold in the north called the Gothic Line. The very next day, on the 4th of June 1944, Clark's American troops walked into Rome, civilians cheering his men on as they walked the streets. For a time, the world's eyes seemed to turn to Rome, and Clark got the attention he had been searching for. But the fame was short-lived, with the entire Italian campaign quickly becoming a secondary theatre of operations, when just 2 days later, D-Day and the cross-channel invasion began. The capture of Rome was a significant milestone, but it had also come at a great cost, with total Allied casualties up to this point exceeding 105,000 men. As the Allies advanced through the country, northern Italy had descended into a brutal civil war that would claim the lives of more than 150,000 people. On one side were the Italian and German fascists, led by Mussolini, and on the other, Italian partisans and communists. But with the war coming to an end and the Germans in full retreat, Mussolini would make a desperate attempt to escape to Switzerland. But by this point, his luck had run out. While fleeing with his mistress, he was caught by Italian partisans, where he would be shot dead. His body was then dragged to Milan, where it was strung up outside a gas station alongside other prominent fascists. Crowds would cheer and beat his body, as it appeared fascism had come to an end. But after the fall of Rome, the fighting in Italy would drag on for almost a year. Pushing northwards, the Allies would take Florence, before reaching the heavily fortified Gothic Line. The line contained over 2,000 machine gun nests, bunkers and artillery positions, constructed by Hitler using slave labour. Facing bad terrain and weather, the Allies would assault the German defences, breaking through several times but never establishing a secure foothold. By April 1945, there would be 1.5 million Allies stationed in Italy, with the Gothic Line finally breaking. Just 4 days later, the Allies would cross the River Po, with the 8th Army advancing northeast towards Venice, and the US 5th Army advancing northwest towards Milan. With the German army defeated on all fronts and in full retreat, they would see no option but to surrender on May 2nd, 1945, just 2 days after the collapse of Berlin. The war in Italy had come to an end. The Allies had destroyed the German army in Italy, but it had come at a great cost. Far from being the soft underbelly Churchill thought it would be, the Allies found themselves attacking what US General Mark Clark called a tough old gut, with the Italian campaign becoming one of the most exhausting and grueling war efforts the Allies would ever embark on. It had taken the Allies 22 months to get from Sicily to the Alps, during which they had sustained over 300,000 casualties. But far from being a failure, the campaign had tied down over 400,000 German soldiers in Italy, giving much needed relief to the Soviets in the east. Across the continent, on the coast of England, 156,000 American, Canadian and British troops lay waiting for a cross-channel invasion. Their targets were the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. D-Day and the liberation of Europe was but a moment away.